The first sign of trouble wasn't a shadow or a sound, but a whisper of a name on a highway sign. We were 200 miles north of Phoenix, deep in the Arizona desert, on a ribbon of asphalt so old and cracked it looked like a dried-up riverbed. The sign for a place called Silence, Arizona, appeared out of the heat haze, a rusty, sun-bleached thing pointing down a dirt road. My buddy, Mark, was driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He'd been quiet for a while, and the name seemed to hit him like a punch. "Silence?" he mumbled, his voice a low thrum against the rattle of the old Jeep. "Heard about that place." I was in the passenger seat, nursing a lukewarm can of soda. "What about it? Another ghost town?" Mark shook his head, a wry, nervous grin on his face. "Not exactly. It's got a reputation. The story goes that anyone who spends the night there goes completely mute. Not just for a day, but forever. Like their vocal cords just forget how to work." My first instinct was to laugh. It sounded like something out of a cheap campfire story. "Sure, Mark. Next you'll tell me about the Mothman." But Mark didn't laugh. He just stared at the sign, a peculiar intensity in his eyes. "No, man, this is different. My grandpa told me about it. He was a truck driver, and he swore every trucker on that route knew to avoid silence like the plague. They'd rather run out of gas than pull off there." We were on our way to the Grand Canyon, but our plans had already gone to hell. The radiator was acting up and the temperature gauge was creeping into the red. It was either risk a complete breakdown in the middle of nowhere or take a chance on silence. The sign promised a rest area just off the main road, and the thought of a working gas station, even a run-down one, was tempting. "Look, the sun's going down," I said, pointing to the bruised orange and purple sky. "We can't just sit here. We can pull in, check out the place, and if it's too creepy, we bail. What's the worst that could happen?" Mark looked at me, his eyes full of a fear I couldn't quite understand. "You don't get it. This place isn't just a ghost town, it's a trap." But the rising steam from the hood made the decision for us. With a sigh of defeat, Mark turned the wheel and the Jeep lurched onto the dirt road. The moment we did, the world changed. The sound of the wind, the low rumble of the highway, all of it seemed to fall away. The only thing left was the crunch of gravel under our tires and the labored hiss of the engine. The air grew still, heavy and hot. The road wound for about a mile before we saw it. The town was a cluster of buildings that looked less like they had been abandoned and more like they had been forgotten. A few single-story houses, their windows like empty sockets, stood sentinel over a main street choked with tumbleweeds. A gas pump, its glass face cracked and yellowed, stood next to a small, two-room motel with a peeling sign that read, "The Silence Motor Lodge." A faded, hand-painted sign next to it advertised gas, water, and rest. "See? Looks fine," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Mark just shook his head, his gaze fixed on the motel. "Fine? Look closer." I did. The windows of the motel rooms were all boarded up from the inside. Not nailed shut, but like the boards had been shoved in from the hallway, wedging them in place. The whole place had a thick, oppressive silence to it. The kind of silence that's not an absence of noise, but a presence of something else. We coasted to a stop by the gas pump. The air here was so still it felt like a physical pressure on my ears. The silence was deep, like the sound of a vacuum. I got out of the car and my boots on the gravel made a noise that seemed to echo for miles. I walked over to the gas pump, but the nozzle was gone, and a thick rope of rusted chain wrapped around the handle. "Well, so much for that," I said, my voice sounding strangely loud in the quiet. Mark didn't answer. He was staring at the motel, his body tense. "Look at the doors," he whispered. I followed his gaze. Every single door on the motel's facade was slightly ajar, just a few inches, a sliver of blackness visible in each one, a perfect, unnerving line. "Creepy," I said, trying to keep my tone light. But Mark didn't laugh. He just stared at the sign. A peculiar intensity in his eyes. "No, man, this is different. My grandpa told me about it. He was a truck driver, and he swore every trucker on that route knew to avoid silence like the plague. They'd rather run out of gas than pull off there." Suddenly, a loud metallic clatter broke the silence. We both jumped, our hearts hammering. The source of the noise was a small, two-story house at the end of the street. An old iron gate had just swung open, creaking on its rusty hinges. The gate had a sign hanging from it, No trespassing, private property. Great, Mark muttered. Looks like someone's home. Maybe they have water. Or a phone, I said, already walking toward the house. We can't just sit here and roast. Mark grabbed my arm. Are you crazy? We're leaving. We can walk. 200 miles is better than whatever this is. But my stomach was churning with a mix of fear and curiosity. The rational part of me knew we should run, but the more primal part, the part that wanted to see what was behind the curtain, was winning. Just for a minute, Mark. We'll be in and out. He reluctantly followed me, his steps heavy with dread. The house was old, built from wood that had been bleached white by the sun. The porch sagged, and the front door was open, a black void inviting us in. We knocked on the warped frame. No answer. "Hello?" I called out. Nothing, just the heavy silence. "Maybe they're not here," I said, pushing the door open a little more. As I did, a gust of wind, or what felt like one, came out of the house, bringing with it the smell of dust and something else, something coppery, like old pennies. We stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind us with a soft click. The interior was a time capsule. Old furniture, covered in white sheets, stood like ghosts in the dim light. The air was thick with the weight of time. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light filtering through a crack in the boarded-up windows. We walked down a long hallway, our footsteps muffled by a thick layer of dust. The house was unnervingly quiet, the silence so complete it felt like a sound. "This is a mistake," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. Suddenly, we heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from the back of the house, a slow, deliberate sound, like someone was knocking on wood. We crept toward it, our hearts in our throats. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, but the rhythm was all wrong. It was uneven, almost frantic. We found the source in a small room at the end of the hall. The room was bare except for a small wooden table and a single rocking chair facing the wall. Sitting in the chair was a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, her back to us. She was dressed in a long white nightgown, her hair a tangle of dark curls. Her hands were on her lap, and she was tapping the table with her fingers, her knuckles making a soft, percussive sound against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. "Hello?" I said softly. The girl froze. Her tapping stopped. The silence came roaring back, a tidal wave of nothing. Slowly, so slowly it was agonizing, she turned her head. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide, black pools. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It was stitched shut with a thick black thread. A single, bloody tear traced a path down her cheek, and her lips, barely visible through the thread, were moving, trying to form words that would never come. Mark gasped, a choked, terrified sound. I grabbed his arm, and we backed away, our minds reeling. This wasn't a campfire story. This was real. As we backed out of the room, a new sound began, a low, scraping noise from the floorboards above us. It was heavy, dragging, and it was getting closer. We bolted. We ran for the front door, yanking on the handle. It was locked. "What?" I screamed, my voice cracking. I rattled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The scraping noise was directly above us now. It stopped, and we heard a soft, wet thud, as if something heavy had just been dropped on the floor. Then a low, guttural whisper echoed through the house, a dry, raspy sound that seemed to come from everywhere, at once. The words were a garble of half-formed syllables, but the intent was clear. "No sound," it hissed. "Be quiet." We ran for the back of the house, past the little girl who was now rocking slowly in her chair, her stitched mouth silently screaming. We burst through the back door and into a small, overgrown backyard. The gate was unlocked, and we sprinted for the Jeep, scrambling in and locking the doors. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. Mark was staring out the window, his eyes wide with horror. "Look," he choked out, pointing toward the town square. I followed his gaze. The doors of the Silence Motor Lodge were no longer just ajar. They were wide open. A shape, long and impossibly thin, was crawling out of the first room, its limbs bending at strange angles. It was followed by another and another, all of them silent, their movements slow and deliberate, like a horrifying ballet. They were pale, almost skeletal, and their faces were a smooth, featureless canvas. They had no eyes, no nose, just a gaping, round maw where a mouth should be. As they crawled, their bodies seemed to undulate, their limbs stretching and contracting with a wet, sickening sound. The creatures, the quiet ones, as Mark had called them, began to move toward us. They didn't run, they didn't even walk, they just flowed. A horrifying river of silent, twitching flesh. I finally got the key in the ignition, but the engine wouldn't turn over. It just made a dry, clicking sound. I tried again, panic seizing my chest, but nothing. "The radiator," I yelled, my voice a high, frantic shriek. "It's dead!" The creatures were closer now, their forms becoming clearer in the setting sun. They were human-like, but grotesquely so. Their skin was the color of old paper, and they moved with a fluidity that was completely unnatural. They moved toward the Jeep, their silent forms a macabre procession. "They're coming for us," Mark screamed, a desperate, hysterical wail. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "They're not coming for us. They're coming for the noise." I realized the horrifying truth. The creatures weren't after our bodies, they were after our voices. They wanted to take the one thing that made us human, the one thing that connected us to the world. They wanted to make us quiet. The little girl with the stitched mouth wasn't a victim. She was a warning. I looked at Mark, and in his eyes I saw not just fear but a flicker of a terrible understanding. He stared at the creature, his lips moving as if he was trying to form words, but no sound came out. He was fighting it, fighting the urge to scream, to cry, to make any noise at all. I knew what he was thinking. We had to be quiet. We had to remain silent. But the fear was too much. The terror was a tangible thing, a physical weight in my lungs. I wanted to scream, to howl, to let the noise of my panic out. And in that moment, as the face of the creature pressed against the glass, Mark's mouth opened. A single, choked, terrified sob escaped his lips. The reaction was instantaneous. The creature on the hood of the Jeep snapped its head toward the sound. Its maw widened, and a long, impossibly thin tongue, black as pitch, shot out. It hit the windshield with the force of a hammer, cracking the glass in a web of fissures. The other quiet ones, sensing the noise, began to move faster, a wave of silent, horrifying movement. "No!" I screamed, a guttural, primal sound of pure terror. And in that moment, a chilling, soul-shattering shriek erupted from the creature. It was not the sound of a voice, but the sound of something tearing. It was the sound of a scream that had been bottled up for years, the sound of 1,000 lost voices all compressed into one single terrifying shriek. It was a sound that didn't just hurt my ears, it felt like it was ripping apart the fabric of my sanity. Slumped in his seat, his eyes staring blankly at the creature, he was silent. Forever. The creature on the hood turned its head toward me, its circular maw still wide open, as if daring me to make another sound. I tried to scream, to cry, to beg for my life, but all that came out was a choking, wet gasp. My throat was on fire. I couldn't make a sound. I tried to speak, to yell, but my vocal cords felt like they were made of stone. The silence had claimed me. I looked at the creature on the hood, then at the others slowly surrounding the Jeep. They didn't need to attack me now. They had what they wanted. They had taken my voice, and now they would wait. They would wait for the next traveler, for the next curious soul to turn down that dirt road. They would wait in the suffocating silence in the town of Silence, Arizona, for the next person to make a sound. My eyes found the little girl in the rocking chair,
visible through the dusty windows of the house. Her stitched mouth was gone. It had been replaced with a perfectly smooth, unblemished patch of skin. She was no longer a victim. She was one of them. A new, quiet one. A new keeper of the silence. I sat in the Jeep, the oppressive silence of the town settling over me like a shroud. The creatures stood around the car, their blank faces a silent judgment. The horror wasn't the sight of them, or the thought of what they did. The true horror was what was happening inside me. The silent scream that was tearing my lungs apart, the terror that had no sound, the knowledge that I would spend the rest of my days, however long they might be, trapped in a silent world, the ghost of my own voice echoing in my mind. And as the sun finally set, and the shadows stretched out like grasping hands, I saw one of the quiet ones reach a long skeletal finger out and trace a line on the dusty windshield. It was a simple single word, written not in the dust, but in my own blood, which was seeping from a small thin cut in my hand. The word was, welcome.